Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This is the second part in our new mini-series, looking at the Heath versus Wilson elections. So Ted Heath and Harold Wilson really were the two dominating political figures of late 1960s, early 1970s British politics, and they fought a remarkable 4 elections against each other. Last time we spoke about the 1966 election that gave Harold Wilson and the Labour Party a landslide majority, and this week we're looking at what is probably seen as being the most surprising of the 4 contests, the 1970 general election, called by incumbent Prime Minister Wilson. So, Richard, where we left it last time was by discussing that in 1964, Wilson got into number 10, but by a whisker, with the slimmest of parliamentary majorities, and he was waiting for the right moment to go back to the country and get a good majority with which he could govern for an entire parliament. That's what he got in 1966. And we said that whatever came next, he would undeniably have to be judged on the basis of his own record, because the reins of power were in his hands. So to kick us off, what did Wilson do with that landslide majority he won in the 1966 election?
Yeah, this is, of course, an unusual example in Labour's history of a Labour government growing its majority in power, something that no other Labour leader has ever been able to do. Ramsay MacDonald and Clement Attlee before Harold Wilson, neither of them were able to grow Labour's majorities in government, and subsequent Labour prime ministers have also failed to do so. This is really the only time in the entire history of the party where it goes from a small majority to a substantive majority, a landslide majority. Now, the Wilson government of 66 to 70 in many ways was a government that was a firefighting government that was dealing with broader economic and social issues such as immigration, which we're going to come on to in this episode. But I think if we were to just think about what this government is remembered for in terms of its achievements, people often think about its achievements in terms of social reforms of that government. And this is a government that liberalized laws relating to abortion, homosexuality, theatre censorship, race relations, and divorce. But what I would say is that those social reforms were not really what the government's main legislative priorities were all about. These were done mainly through private members' bills. There was a lot of division within the Labour ranks over them. They were, in most cases, passed through on the basis of free votes where they weren't whipped. So if we were to think about actually what was the Wilson government doing in legislative terms, I think you'd have to look more at, say, educational reforms. This is a government that expands higher and further education with the expansion of the polytechnics, with the establishment of the Open University, the University of the Air, as it was called, a great reforming educational experiment to offer the opportunity of higher education to people who had not had that opportunity maybe when they were at school. This is also a government that, in addition to firefighting on the economy, did do some good, what I would see as more kind of traditional socialist state aid and state planning. So the Wilson government finally is able to renationalize steel. It's able to embark on a proper industrial strategy. Once again, there's huge government investment in production and manufacturing. The government provides capital for the setting up of employment in all kind of parts of the country. And this is a government that's about spreading economic and employment opportunities away from the clusters that are doing well to the parts of the country that aren't. The government brings in basically a subsidy for wages if you are employing people in what were called kind of government economic development zones. So these are more depressed parts of the country. If you're an employer and you set up operation in that part of the country. The government will top up the wages of the people working there, and there's huge investment in research and development. So this is this is the white heat of technology, the Ministry of Technology. Under the leadership of Tony Benn, is pursuing a huge range of investment in terms of atomic energy, radar. There's the National Physical Laboratories. There's a lot going on. The final thing I'll say, Lee, because you've been waiting very patiently, the final thing I'll say is that this should be a government that should be recognized for its foreign policy near misses, perhaps. The first near miss is the application to the common market, the European Economic Community. And many people would say this was a failure of the Wilson government because Wilson applied to join and then the application was vetoed. I think that Wilson always expected it to be vetoed. I don't think that he was really expecting that to be a success, but that was actually a very clever political managerial exercise where Wilson could hold together the pro-European by making the application, but he could keep the anti-Europeans on side by knowing that Charles de Gaulle would veto the application at the end. It's quite clever. But really, the other thing we have to say on foreign policy with this Wilson government is this is the height of the Vietnam War. There's huge pressure from the United States for Britain to send troops into Vietnam, and Wilson resists that pressure. He gets a lot of flack from Labour MPs because they think he's not sufficiently critical in his rhetoric about the Johnson administration, and he doesn't condemn the war. But to be honest, actions are more important than words. And I think I would rather have a prime minister who was a bit quieter in his condemnation of the war than a prime minister who sent British troops into a military quagmire, as was the Vietnam War.
But whilst Wilson was doing all these things that you've discussed, Heath was pretty busy as well. I mean, Ted Heath, who had been elected leader of the Conservative Party in 1965, he was mostly busy actually just opposing, in a very reactionary way, pretty much everything that Wilson tried to do. The thing I would most try and emphasize about Edward Heath in these years is that I don't think we should see him as being a particularly strategic leader. After large general election defeats like in 1966, very heavy defeat for the Conservatives, quite often parties try to go back to basics, strip their policy agenda bare, back down to fundamentals, and try and build up a new agenda for that era from first principles. That's not something that Ted Heath is interested in doing at all. He basically remains committed and wedded to his 1966 manifesto and most of the policies that are in it. The way in which his policy agenda evolves to some degree is simply by opposing the things that Wilson is doing in this time, even when deep down, I think actually there are grounds to think that Ted Heath agreed with them. And even when, and we'll come on to this about devaluation in a moment, even when majorities of his shadow cabinet or his own shadow chancellor thinks that what the government is doing is probably the correct thing. But such is the vitriolic bitterness between Heath and Wilson that Heath cannot bring himself basically to stand up in the House of Commons and say, congratulations, Prime Minister. Congratulations, Mr. Wilson. This is a very good thing that you've done here. We support you. He's so loath to do that at almost any time.
I would say, though, from a constitutional perspective, that's probably the right thing to do. Part of the way that we have scrutiny in our system is that we have a robust opposition that opposes the government. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the opposition has to maintain that opposition when itself comes into government, and often it doesn't. We see that policies embed themselves over time, and although people claim that under the British political system you have these massive shifts in policy, I think it's actually much more subtle than that. So I'm sure part of it was personal, but I also think that it's good opposition practice to oppose the government, generally speaking, except perhaps on rare matters where there is a wider national interest at stake. And I'm reluctant to defend Ted Heath, but I will on this case, showing how fair-minded I can be.
Of course, he was quite literally lead with the opposition, so it's not a criticism in and of itself to say he opposed what the government did. You're right that that was the purpose of him. But I think quite often what very smart leaders of the opposition do is recognize that the country doesn't like, or the public and the electorate doesn't like the idea of opposition for opposition's sake. So you try and pick a couple of good moments, either where you can be seen to give the government its majority, or where you can be seen as being especially magnanimous and putting party politics aside for the sake of the country. But that's not really something that occurs to Ted Heath in this period. If we're to think about how the Ted Heath of 1970 is different to the Ted Heath of 1966, I think there's one word that comes to mind, and it's yachts. So it's during this period, on the eve of his 50th birthday, basically, that Ted Heath decides to take up yachting. And this becomes a great new adventurous pastime of his. He throws himself into it with a zealousness second only to the way in which he throws himself into his life in politics. And in many ways, this is seen as a way to try and excite people about Ted Heath and to inject a sense of dynamism into his popular persona. But it's also one I think is incredibly risky. It's a very risky way of doing it. I mean, it's not one that I think a PR company would necessarily suggest to a leader of the opposition or a prime minister who is seen, not inaccurately, given his media appearances, as being quite stiff and difficult and awkward. But it's a risk because what if he was really bad? What if Ted Heath ended up throwing himself into being a yachtsman and it turns out he's a disaster or his boat sinks? And one of the great tests of that is in late 1969 when he enters the Sydney-Hobart race, a 640-mile yachting race from Sydney to Hobart, two places in Australia. And this is one of the great prestigious ocean-going races in the world. And it hasn't been won by a British person since 1945. Ted Heath enters, and that year it is won by a British person, but not just any British person. Remarkably, it is won by the leader of the Conservative Party, who has not just become an amateur yachtsman, but has quite remarkably become one of the most accomplished yachtsmen in the world.
It seems a rather strange pastime to choose to bolster your man of the people credentials. Given that Edward Heath had been elected Conservative leader in 1965, in part to demonstrate that he was part of the new, upwardly socially mobile generation, that he was not part of the old public school aristocratic brigade that had characterized his predecessors, of course, most notably his immediate predecessor, the 14th Earl of Hume. Why do you choose a rich person's sport, yachting, to make yourself a more interesting and relatable leader of the opposition?
Well, I think because it undeniably does make him more interesting, but you're right, not necessarily relatable. And I think for that, we should really try and think about some of the ways in which Wilson and Heath think of their own PR and their own public image. Wilson, of course, is obsessed with appearing like a man of the people. Whether it's his pipe smoking, which is much discussed, his professed love of tinned salmon, his HP sauce on his breakfast, or the Gannex raincoat that he was often seen wearing, or even the video clips that you can see of Harold Wilson, where he's sat at home with one of his children, helping repair their bicycle on the dining room table. Wilson was clearly obsessed with this image of himself as being an ordinary man of the people. I don't think Heath was, partly because I think Heath didn't feel that he had to try and convey a sense of being a man of the people. I mean, he had come from a relatively modest background, arguably, if anything, more modest than Wilson himself had. So I don't think he really felt he had to prove much in that sense. Secondly, his grounding in politics was within what was still quite a wealthy and aristocratic political party. So yes, he was elected leader in 1965 to be the Conservatives' answer to Harold Wilson, but he wasn't necessarily elected by somebody who liked the idea of a Tory leader who looked quite like Mr. Wilson did. There was some sense of actually snobbery against him within the party, which I think would have influenced how he thought about politics at the time. And also, I think rather than trying to be a man of the people, I think what they wanted to inject into Heath's public persona was that he was a man of action and energy and excitement. And I think undeniably, going to the other side of the world to enter this ocean-going yacht competition and then winning it does that, even if you're right, it doesn't make you look like the man on the Clapham omnibus.
Well, we've spoken quite a lot about the style of the men, but let's look a little bit more at the substance of what was going on in that period. I've talked a great deal about the successes, as I would see them, of the Wilson government, but there are undoubtedly many difficulties, some might say failures as well. And one of them, of course, was over the issue of the value of the British pound. This was known as the devaluation crisis. So, Lee, can you tell us a little bit about that problem that the Wilson government faced?
Yeah, so I think the big picture context that we need to keep in mind here is that at this time, the value of the currency was seen as being intimately connected to national prestige. So when a currency was devalued, there was a widespread perception in politics and in the country more generally that that was as if Britain was being devalued and cheapened on the world stage. And the other important thing to note about this period is that it's not like now, a period of floating exchange rates. So the value of the pound sterling was fixed against the US dollar, and it was fixed at a value of $2.80 to the pound. Now, this was widely seen by people as being too high a valuation for the British currency. And one of the challenges that presented was that it meant that it was difficult for British exporters to compete in the world marketplace. Now, the very sensible thing to do in that situation is to try and devalue your currency. But that comes with political risks because of this issue of national prestige and its connection to the value of currency. So sterling had been devalued in 1949 under the last Labour government led by Clement Attlee. Harold Wilson was in the cabinet at that time, and there were great political ramifications for that as well. At that time, the devaluation was enormous. It was about 40% of the value of sterling was devalued in 1949. And Wilson did not want the Labour Party to get a reputation for getting into office, having currency crises, devaluing the currency, and therefore being seen as having undermined Britain's role in the world and its relationship, its economic relationship to the other powers of the world. So therefore, they spent a lot of time, particularly in 1967, trying to prop up the value of the pound sterling. This leads to a great deal of pressure building economically. There has to be credit lines from the International Monetary Fund and others to try and keep the strategy of propping up the pound going until it breaks, until it just can't go on any longer. And the Wilson cabinet agrees that they will devalue sterling. They'll devalue it to $2.40. So it's not a massive devaluation, really. It's about 14% of the value of the currency. And that's when Wilson makes his, arguably, his second most famous speech, in fact. I think his most famous speech is probably the much quoted speech about the white heat of technology. I don't think he uses those exact words, but the white heat of the technological revolution. But his second most famous speech is possibly the broadcast he makes to the nation in November 1967 to tell them that the pound sterling has been devalued, but that the pound in your pocket has not been devalued. And this becomes one of the great iconic phrases of this period and is such a memorable phrase that it helps the policy of devaluation stick in people's minds for the rest of Wilson's time in power, really.
And it's at this time that Wilson makes a very significant change to his cabinet, where he replaces the Chancellor, who, since Labour had come in 1964, was Jim Callaghan, with Roy Jenkins, who had been the Home Secretary. So Jenkins had been the Home Secretary who had overseen most of those kind of social reforms, those private members' bills that would be navigated with sotto voce support from Jenkins in particular. And Wilson does a swap. And part of the reason for that is that Callaghan had been saying for so long that we will not devalue the pound. And then when it becomes clear they're going to have to devalue the pound, Callaghan's position as Chancellor is untenable. I think this is actually a really important historical precedent here that Keir Starmer might want to think about.
It's such a severe crisis, really, I think, for Wilson devaluation and his reputation. And in many ways, this is a moment at which the Wilson honeymoon undeniably ends after the 1966 landslide win. And actually, Ted Heath, people start to look at him as being a possible future prime minister. But he's got issues as well going on within his party, even though he's only got the burdens of opposition and not of government. And the biggest issue that I think Ted Heath probably faces during this time is not a policy, but a man, Enoch Powell. So in 1968, Enoch Powell goes from being a relatively obscure politician in some respects to being one of the most famous politicians in the country and arguably the most popular as well. A little bit of background to this. People will know what it is we're going to come on to discuss, but a little bit of background to this. Powell was, in many ways, a nightmare colleague for other politicians. He was not somebody who was a good team player. And that manifested itself in this period because he basically refused to accept that collective responsibility. This idea that in the cabinet, for example, that once the cabinet agrees a policy, then everybody must defend that policy because that is the government's policy. He believed that did not apply to shadow cabinets, and therefore he should have a free rein to say whatever he liked about matters of the day. Now, he may, in one sense, have been strictly accurate in his narrow interpretation of the ways in which burdens upon government apply or do not apply to opposition. But in practice, it's an intolerable thing to do because basically you're suggesting that a shadow defense spokesman, as he was, should be able to go around and contradict his own leader on questions of policy, which is simply not possible. But this was the sort of thing that Enoch Powell would do. He was a one-man band, really, in politics, not a great team player. And in 1968, one of the manifestations of that is that he gives a speech in Birmingham about immigration and the effects of immigration in recent years. It's been famously recalled as the Rivers of Blood speech because of one of the metaphors that he uses in the speech. Now, without reflecting too much on the morality of the speech and the inflammatory language that he uses, which he uses horrible language in the speech, which part of the reason I don't want to reflect in it is I don't want to quote from it. And people will be familiar with much of what he says. It also shows how he's a pretty awful colleague. So the trigger for the speech in some respects is the Race Relations Act, which the Labour government is passing to try and rid discrimination on racial grounds from the way in which the British economy, the British state and British society functions. The Conservative view on that, one that Enoch Powell was actually intimately involved with devising, was to say that they opposed the bill but agreed with the principle of racial harmony. So on that issue, there was no real disagreement between Powell and Heath. Yet Powell decides to give this speech. He knows the speech is going to catch media attention. He knows it's going to be inflammatory. He organises for television cameras to be there to record him. This is not a big speech. It's not like he's addressing 10,000 people in an arena. This is a Conservative political centre meeting that would not ordinarily be picked up by television cameras. And he makes this highly inflammatory speech. And as well as getting it televised, he also doesn't get sign-off from any senior colleagues in the shadow cabinet for the speech, even though it's not strictly speaking in his policy area, it's much more closely related to theirs. And it's, of course, a speech that's of interest to Heath as leader as well. But he makes this highly inflammatory speech, and the backlash is immediate. Part of the backlash is internal to the Conservative Party. The shadow chancellor, Ian MacLeod, people like Quintin Hogg, the shadow Home Affairs spokesperson, all say, if you do not sack Enoch Powell from the shadow cabinet, we will resign. So the Conservatives, senior Conservatives, are furious with Enoch Powell for doing this. They think he's been a bad colleague. They think he's used inflammatory language on purpose. They think he's set back arguments about race relations in this country and about immigration policy in this country, something I think is definitely true. And they say he has to go. So Heath sacks him from the shadow cabinet. But the second part of the response to this speech is in the public. And among the public, there's a big rush of support in Enoch Powell's direction. And there is polling that says he is the most popular politician in the country. And so suddenly for Ted Heath, you're the leader of the Conservative Party. You're fighting to oppose a Labour government and to try and get your party ready to retake office. And the most popular politician in the country is somebody else in your party who you've had to sack and who is causing all sorts of problems for you now on the backbenches. It's an incredibly difficult position for Heath to be in. There are two other big issues I think we should just touch on very briefly that are important at this time. There's Northern Ireland and there's trade union reform. So it's these years leading up to the 1970 general election are when the troubles really begins to start in Northern Ireland. And it's actually seen as being something that the Labour government responds to very well in the first instance. So Jim Callaghan, who's been moved as Chancellor to be Home Secretary, he's seen as responding to it in a very authoritative way. The Labour Party itself is seen as having more credibility on the issue in one sense, to be a fair arbiter between both sides, the Protestant and the Catholic side in Northern Ireland, because the Conservative Party is in an arrangement with the Ulster Unionist Party in Parliament. So the UUP MPs at the time take the Conservative whip in the House of Commons, whereas Labour is seen as being slightly less biased than that. And in fact, people like Ben Pimlott, the great celebrated biographer of Harold Wilson, among other people, says that he believes that this was one of the issues that really helped Labour recover somewhat after the devaluation crisis, that they'd had a problem in which they looked like their leadership was very weak, and then they have an issue in which their leadership appears to be quite strong. But there are other issues where their leadership appears very weak. And one of them is trade union reform. So, Richard, I know this is something you've written about and studied. And so Barbara Castle publishes a white paper called In Place of Strife, which is on trade union reform, and it's deeply divisive within the Labour Party.
Yeah, so I think part of the important context here is that one of the battles that the Wilson government has from the kind of the wider economic picture is over inflation. And there is a period in this government where there are work stoppages at Britain's docks. And this is an attempt to secure greater pay for the dock workers. And it angered Wilson a great deal because actually his government had done quite a bit to try to regularize the employment in Britain's docks, which had been really a appallingly casualized workforce, and it was a very precarious situation. In some ways, it went to the other side of that ledger, where it became a very secure form of employment, such that people basically couldn't be sacked for not showing up to work and things like that. But Wilson criticizes the shipyard workers. He has this infamous line about politically motivated men causing industrial strife. John Prescott actually was one of the people who was involved in that industrial action. And so he comes up with the idea that we need to have a clearer footing for the grounds on which you can have industrial action in the country. And in his view, this was opening up the decision about industrial action from a small cadre of union leaders to the wider membership and to all of the workers who might be affected by strike action and have to take strike. And basically, this was about balloting for industrial action. So he asked Barbara Castle, who's employment secretary, to take on this task. As you say, she develops a white paper called In Place of Strife. This is an homage. The title of it, I think it's sometimes forgotten. It's an homage to Aneurin Bevan, the founder of the health service. Bevan wrote a book called In Place of Fear, which was his sort of testament about what socialism meant to him in Britain. I can remember reading my grandfather's copy when I was a teenager, and it meant sort of one of those kind of moments where I felt, oh, I'm definitely a socialist after reading this book. So Castle comes at this actually from the left. The left at the time were very suspicious of the trade unions. They believed that the trade unions were not motivated for a wider social purpose, but were for their narrow economic interests. And the trade unions were associated with the right of the party. So by clipping the wings and the trade union leaders, which is what Castle was trying to do, it was actually more of an attack on the right of the party than on the left. Today, people don't understand that because they assume that the trade unions are always going to be further to the left than the left of the Labour Party, but that's not quite the case. And in the end, In Place of Strife is killed off, not so much from the left of the party, although there were people on the left who were antagonistic to it, but from the right. And Jim Callaghan, who was one of the leading figures of the Labour right in that Wilson government, is probably the main instigator in killing it. And it's one of the things that Barbara Castle never forgives Callaghan for. They did not have a good relationship. And of course, when Callaghan becomes Prime Minister in 1976, very first thing he does is he sacks Barbara Castle from the cabinet, and there really was no love there. But it's a huge embarrassment for Castle. I think it is the reason why she effectively loses any hope of becoming Labour leader. It's a great tragedy for her personally and for the country, in my view. But it's also embarrassing for Wilson. And to be honest, also, it wasn't great for British trade unionism because it opened up the flank for a much more vicious Tory attack that you would see under the Heath government.
It's an undeniable humiliation for Harold Wilson, I think in part because it shows that his leadership, as a leader, he can't even control his own side. And so the cabinet, of course, is divided about this, but also, of course, the Labour Party is intimately entwined with the trade union movement in this country and financially dependent upon it. And so you've got a Labour government amidst all of these issues of industrial unrest that can't manage to regulate trade unionism. I think it's one of his moments of greatest weakness. And this feeds through into the polls, particularly in 1968 and early 1969. So one of the things which I said at the outset is that in many ways this election is a shock when it comes. And part of the reason it's a shock is that in the months leading up to polling day, everybody expects Harold Wilson to win and to win very comfortably. But during the midterm period of this parliament, there are very few signs that Labour's in a good electoral position. So when the Greater London Council was up for election, the Conservatives, staggeringly, won 82 of the 100 seats on the Greater London Council. And in the same set of local elections, won control of Bradford, Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, and Newcastle, and began winning a huge number of by-election victories, including in places like Walthamstow, Cambridge, and Leicester. And it's in fact in some of the by-elections that you can see the scale of Labour's problems. There are two that I wanted to focus on in particular. There's a by-election in 1968 in Oldham West. Now, previously that had had a Labour majority of 7,500 with over 61% of the vote. But when the by-election comes, Labour's vote drops by 27.6%, and it ends up with a Conservative majority of over 3,000. And then there's a Dudley by-election as well in the Midlands in 1968, which had previously been a Labour majority of over 10,000 from the 1966 general election. And in that case, Labour again had just shy of 60% of the vote. But in that case, Labour's vote drops by 25%. The Conservative vote is up by 17%, and it ends up with a Conservative majority at the by-election of over 11,500. So you can see in some of these contests that following devaluation, following in place of strife, and the climb down over trade union reform, Harold Wilson and the Labour Party is catastrophically unpopular. I don't want to say Keir Starmer levels of unpopularity because I think they're unparalleled, but it's getting that way. He's a deeply unpopular Prime Minister and government at the time.
And one of the main policies, I think, that was making the government unpopular was its prices and incomes policy, which was effectively wage and price controls to hold down inflation. And of course, that is one way you can hold down inflation, is you can make it illegal for people to get wage increases, and you can force shops to sell goods at certain price points. And from a socialist perspective, that's consistent with something of a planned economy. But it was very controversial, and a lot of workers who had been accustomed to seeing regular pay increases now were told that the government was making it impossible, legally impossible for them to get wage increases, and people reacted very badly to that. This is also a time where the British elite are unhappy as well with the government. So it's not just the working class, it's also the aristocracy, the elite, with the government pursuing socialist policies. And you hear of Cecil King, who was a newspaper proprietor, meeting with some of his wealthy and influential friends and having discussions about whether they should organize some kind of coup and remove Harold Wilson as prime minister and create some kind of national government under the premiership of the Earl Mountbatten, Louis Mountbatten, the uncle of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the uh, former Viceroy of India. Really quite absurd, and I think there was absolutely no interest from the perspective of the palace, i.e. Queen Elizabeth II, to indulge in this kind of activity. But it does underscore the kind of fever pitch sense of chaos that's going on in kind of 1967, 68, 69 in British politics.
So the question then becomes, how does Wilson go from being a electoral dud, a down and out in political terms, to calling a general election for June 1970 that he is almost universally expected to win? Well, in the autumn of 1969, the polls begin to narrow. What were 20+% Tory polling leads vanish, and pretty soon into the new year, they're down to single digits. Wilson, it's almost as if he's feeding on this change in the public mood. He seems to grow more confident during this time, and he seems his stature is improving after the low points of previous years. And he's beginning to make jokes at Ted Heath's expense very effectively, and seems to be in the slipstream of an improving public mood. So much so that in the May local elections of 1970, the Labour Party makes gains. It gains some of the seats that they've lost in recent years. And the Gallup poll shows that Labour are now in the lead, having been 20% behind just a year earlier, are now in the lead by 7.5%. And this begins to convince Wilson that he's been Prime Minister now since 1964. The last electoral mandate that he had came in March 1966. That will expire at some point in the following year. So he's beginning to think of, right, I need to go back to the country. When is a good time? And all of that combines to make him think that the 18th of June, 1970, would be the right time to go to the country.
And of course, in the last episode, we talked about the deftness, the skill that Wilson had in timing that 1966 election, where he picked probably the best possible month to have a general election that would lead to a Labour victory. And Wilson views himself as a very politically canny figure. I think he was one of the great political masters of British politics of the 20th century in so many different ways. And I think Wilson looked at those local election results and thought, okay, this is my 1966 moment. This is my time to go in. Things are not necessarily going to get better. They've been pretty bad before. I had a bad period in 64, 65. I was able to recover and seize the moment, and I'm going to do the same again in 1970. There was also, interestingly, some speculation that the government did not want an election in 1971 because in February of 1971, Britain was going to change from pounds, shillings, and pence to a decimal-based currency, so a fractional to a decimal-based currency. And there was a fear that this would be quite unpopular with the British public that had become very attached and accustomed to the way in which what we would call the old money used to work. And so they just didn't want to have that drama going on in the background of an election campaign as well. So there were a lot of indicators pointing to a June 1970 election as a pretty sensible time to call the election.
Absolutely. And there was also a sense that a June election might wrong-foot the Conservatives, who by this stage were quite widely reported as expecting the election to come in the autumn. But the Conservatives were, in fact, quite well prepared. And one of the symbols of their preparation was a gathering that took place in early 1970 at Selsdon Park, which is a hotel near Croydon in Surrey. This has become one of the iconic moments, really, of the lead up to this general election. So it was not a big deal, the gathering in some respects. It was the shadow cabinet. They were there to discuss the policy agenda that in part had been made up on the hoof by Ted Heath in the preceding years, and to get collective buy-in to that being it was in the manifesto. Of course, this is also a time of much shorter election campaigns. When the election gets called on the 18th of May, it's for the 18th of June. That's a relatively tight period in which to get your manifesto in shape and published and out there. So they want to have the framework of that agenda agreed in advance. But the media hear that the Tory shadow cabinet are gathering and start to turn up, and there's a discussion about what on earth we're going to tell them. Now, this is quite a dull meeting in some respects to just agree the policy framework for the next election. And it suggested, accounts vary, it's suggested either by Ian MacLeod or by Quintin Hogg, that we should say to the press, well, people always care about law and order. That's a good issue for us. Tell them we're discussing our policy on law and order. And this gets written up as a toughening of the Tory message on crime. And then that gets interpreted more broadly. It's like a snowball that gains its own momentum as a shift to the right in conservative thinking going into the next election, which Wilson chooses to jump on. So the phrase that becomes very famously associated with that gathering is the idea of Selsdon man. But that's not a media coinage, to my knowledge. It's a Harold Wilson concept. Harold Wilson came up with the idea of Selsdon man. It's an attempt to try and reference a discovery of a Neolithic or an ancient body, basically. They say that this is a Stone Age set of views that the Tories are coming out with at Selsdon Park, and that Selsdon man is the manifestation of right-wing thinking to try and undo the last quarter of a century of progressive social policy and other aspects of policy in the United Kingdom. So Wilson jumps on this idea of there being a rightward shift in the Conservative Party going into the election. It's not really true. It doesn't really happen. But certainly Selsdon man is remembered as being the manifestation of Tory policy for the 1970 election.
I mean, that insight is quite interesting because my perception of Selsdon man was it wasn't just about crime, it was about economic policy, and it was a view that the Conservative Party was in effect giving up on the post-war consensus around the welfare state and public services, that this was going to be a Conservative government that cut spending on social services, that cut taxes, and also a government that was much more anti-trade union than the other post-war Conservative governments had been. And I thought that, in a sense, this is the other side of Powellism that people forget, is that not only did Enoch Powell have very restrictive views on immigration, but he was very right-wing on economics. And Harold Wilson says something like, what Enoch says today, Edward will be pronouncing 3 to 6 months from now. In other words, that Enoch Powell is effectively guiding Conservative Party policy, but where I think he's making that point is not so much on immigration, but is actually on economic policy.
Yeah, so definitely economic aspects to the way in which Selsdon man is remembered. But I think in a sense they're also overhyped. So if we take two issues in particular, one, the welfare question. As you mentioned in the last episode, the Conservatives go into the 1966 election opposing the universalist principle of welfare. That dates back to Beveridge. So already lots of these ideas had been rehearsed by Ted Heath. And on prices and incomes policy, which is one of the defining economic policies really of this period, the Conservatives had said separately, and would say again in the manifesto, but they said previously to this, that they were opposed to the prices and incomes policy. Now, in many ways, that was a hostage to fortune for Heath, given what was to come. But he had already made the suggestion that he was opposed to it in principle, which is much stronger than he actually felt. But he had been so keen to oppose what Wilson was doing on the economy that he suggested firm opposition to a prices and incomes policy before the Selsdon conference and afterwards as well. So I don't really see it as being this shift. In some ways, I see those ideas as being either a continuation of Tory thinking that goes back to 1966 at least, or the logical conclusion of the reactionary approach to opposition that Heath had adopted in the preceding years, where if Wilson did it, he said no. And by the time you add up all of those no's from Ted Heath, You almost get, in effect, a policy agenda that is just the opposite of what the government has done, which didn't necessarily speak to deep down what Ted Heath really thought or what senior figures in the Conservative Party really thought, but were just the conclusion of the positions they had adopted in the preceding years. But I think we should come on to the election itself and the election result. So when the election is called, it's just worth saying that this is an election with some really profound differences from the perspective of the voter in terms of how they engage with going to the polls. So it's the first election in which 18-year-olds have the vote. It's also the first election with the names of the political parties on the ballot paper. That's a remarkable thing, really, to think that you used to go and vote without knowing the party name on the ballot paper. It really did demand a greater level of political awareness on the part of the voter. It would have been an election in which there was a boundary review. So we spoke last time about how the boundaries in 1966 favoured Labour quite significantly. But in the lead up to this election, Jim Callaghan, the Home Secretary, as this was within his remit at the time, decided that that would be postponed for this general election. So the boundary review went for pretty cynical reasons, I think it has to be said. But certainly notwithstanding the lack of a boundary review, this is a different style of election from the perspective of the voter.
Well, that reform about putting the party name on the ballot turned out to be very important for Edward Heath, because in his constituency of Bexley, a gentleman had changed his name by deed poll to Edward Heath and stood against Heath on the ballot in a hope to confuse the voters as to which Heath to vote for in the election. This is actually an old trick that the Kennedy family used to use in America. In Heath's case, the fake Edward Heath only got 1,000 votes in his constituency, which was no real threat to him. Another reform that happened in this election is the first time that we had polling stations open till 10 o'clock at night in Britain. And that's, I think, one of the nice things about British politics is that people who are working can go home, put the kids to bed, and then they could go out to vote. And this just extended that possibility. It's also the first election with an exit poll, and the exit poll is conducted entirely in one constituency in Gravesend in Kent. And we become now so accustomed to what does the exit poll say? Well, this is the first election where they could do that.
Before we come on to the results in detail, we should just talk a little bit about the campaign and the shape of the campaign. So at the point at which Wilson goes to the palace in the middle of May, he is overwhelmingly expected to win. The Conservative Party are fighting it all the same, but they're prepared for defeat. People are going to Ted Heath towards the closing stages of the campaign to say, when you lose, not really if you lose even, but when you lose, you must resign. Something he says you would have always done anyway. But it's during the campaign period, those essential 4 weeks between dissolution and people going to the polls, that some things begin to change. What the Conservative Party tries to do is really have, I think, two big themes of their pitch into the election. The one that I think is unsuccessful, but was certainly the most sincerely held by Heath, was the idea that Wilson was a shallow, gimmicky, unserious politician, and that was reflected in his style of government and his approach to leading the nation. This was something I think Heath felt quite deeply in a way. There's an anecdote that Dennis Healy, who was also at Balliol College, Oxford, at the same time as Ted Heath, recounted years later, in which he said that Healy and Heath were once walking through the college, and Healy mentioned that a mutual friend of theirs was going off to a country pub that weekend with his girlfriend and pretending that they were husband and wife so that they could share a room together without raising eyebrows. And Heath apparently was outraged by this and the thought that they might be sleeping together, and asked Healy whether or not that was the case, to which Healy said, well, I assume so. And Heath simply said, I can't imagine anyone in the Conservative Association doing that. And he almost maintains this sort of view throughout his life in lots of ways. He has a tricky relationship with the Conservative Party, of course, and a relationship that gets much, much trickier in the years to come. But he almost sees Labour as doing these underhand, grubby, immoral things in government, and effectively cannot imagine the Conservative Party doing the same. And so that's part of the attack that Heath tries to make. The second focus of the criticism, and I think this is the one that is much more successful, is about the economy. So he makes a big pitch that Labour's economic mismanagement, devaluation, failure to get a grip on unions and strike days is a miserable record. And against that, Wilson and Jenkins, by now the Chancellor, have a great tool in their arsenal to try and say, actually, Heath is wrong about this. The economy's turned a corner. Things are looking much better. And it's the balance of trade figures. So this is a period of time in which the balance of trade is seen as being one of the defining metrics of how well the British economy is doing. Are we making and exporting more than we're having to import from around the world? For a significant period of time, Britain had been importing more than it was exporting. And that was seen as a sign, particularly given the history of the British economy, that was seen as a great sign of weakness. But in the months leading up to the general election, Britain was showing a trade surplus. We were suddenly exporting far more, inevitably a consequence, in part, of the devaluation that had happened and been so politically costly. And if the political ramifications of that were the downside, then these improved trade figures were the upside. But then the Monday of polling week, new figures come out on the balance of trade, and they show a £31 million deficit. That's the first deficit in a series of months. And it allows Heath to turn around and say, well, this is now the reality of the economy under Labour laid bare. Wilson and co said that things had turned a corner and we were all heading for the sunlit uplands on the horizon. But these figures now show the reality underneath the bonnet of the UK economy. And it's much worse than Wilson would have had you think.
Labour had tried to present its message in this campaign as that it was still the party of great dynamism and the kind of new modernizing force in British politics. The Labour manifesto is like a victory lap of different achievements of that government. But you're right, Lee, that the main policy point, of course, is the economy, and the balance of trade figures is unfortunate. It is somewhat skewed by the fact that the government had undertaken a massive purchase of US military equipment shortly before the election, which skews it overinflated the deficit figures. Barbara Castle blames Labour's defeat in that election on the Chancellor, Roy Jenkins. She writes a little epilogue in her diaries, which I will have to just read out because it just sort of captures something of Barbara Castle's great acidic tone sometimes. So she says, an interesting footnote to the election came a few days later in a piece by The Guardian, by normally a Roy Jenkins fan. It was headed, quote, "How Roy Muffed It," and it argued that the expenditure figures just published by the Central Statistical Office confirmed that production and consumption were stagnant on polling day, and that Roy Jenkins could have budgeted more generously for growth and for the election. It was no good fighting on a balance of payment surplus when the housekeeping money was still in deficit. In other words, the Chancellor had thrown the election away. It was a view which a lot of people in the Labour movement shared, full stop, and that's the end of her diaries. So you see there that she does think that these figures could have been more skillfully managed, and she puts Roy Jenkins's political ineptitude at the heart of that defeat.
Three things I just want to say in response to that. You mentioned about the Labour manifesto, which, by the way, had an appalling title. It was called Now Britain's Strong, Let's Make Her Great to Live In, which is really not a great sort of title for a manifesto at all. It's not. The Tory one, by contrast, was called A Better Tomorrow. So Heath wins the title war, if nothing else. But a manifesto is not meant to be a list of private achievements. It's meant to be a prescription for the country's ills and an agenda for what you're going to do to correct them. And that's what I think Wilson is missing throughout much of this campaign, because he's leading a very complacent message. Secondly, on the trade figures, the balance of trade figures, and this idea that they were knocked off course by a jumbo jet or a couple of jumbo jet purchases. In many ways, I think that makes Ted Heath's point for him, that if the entire UK economy and its reporting of trade figures can be knocked out of kilter by the purchasing of a couple of planes, then really does not show the robust economy that a manifesto called Now Britain Strong would really suggest. And finally, on this idea of Roy Jenkins and the budget, it is interesting that when you look at the Conservative governments, for example, from 1951 to 64, they did have a pretty scandalous habit of just before a general election having a very generous giveaway budget. That would really be a bribe to the voters to try and keep them in office. Jenkins declines to do that going into this election. Jenkins doesn't do a big handout to the voters to try and earn their affections going into polling day. It's certainly an honest and a creditable thing to have done, but Barbara Castle may have a point about whether or not it's a politically shrewd move.
And just one final thing to say about this election, now more in terms of style than substance, is that Labour ran a advertising campaign against the Conservatives where they called the Conservative shadow cabinet yesterday's men. And again, it was to present this sense of contrast between this reforming, modernising Labour government and the same old Tories, basically. Somewhat incoherent in a way, because they were also trying to say that the Tories had kind of gone in a completely new direction, in a Powellite right-wing economic direction. But there are these little figurines that are made of the different Conservative shadow cabinet figures, and these little figurines are then taken pictures of, and they go on poster boards and billboards across the country. And we'll put some of those images up, I think, on our Instagram, and we'll tweet some of those out later on. But I think now it's worth the drum roll here for the great result. Labour was going in expecting to have another great victory. I mean, Wilson thought that Labour would lose seats. He wasn't deluded to think that he could win and gain seats again, as he did in 66. But I think there was a pretty broad, soft consensus on the Labour side that this was going to be another majority Labour government. Barbara Castle writes in her diaries that she had a sense of foreboding about the election, and she thought that her colleagues were too complacent. But generally speaking, Wilson and those around him thought that this was going to be a third consecutive Labour victory. But of course, it didn't work out that way. So tell us a little bit more about those results, Lee.
Well, absolutely. I think Marcia Williams says that this is the only one of the elections that Wilson led the party into, that she was confident that they were going to win. And in fact, it ends up being the only one that he loses. So the Conservatives under Edward Heath poll 46.4% of the vote. That's up 4.5 percentage points since 1966, and helps them gain 77 seats to end up on a total of 330. Harold Wilson and the Labour Party poll 43.1% of the vote. That's down almost 5 percentage points, for a net loss of 75 seats, leaving them on 288. And for the Liberals, people who aren't big players necessarily at this particular time in this mini-series, but will become a bigger deal in the next couple of episodes, they drop 1 percentage point down to 7.5% of the poll, and that ends up losing them half of their constituencies. So they end up going down to 6 members of parliament, down from 12. One of the things that's a very striking feature of this election night, if ever you watch the coverage from the BBC, is that the first result to declare is in Guildford, where David Howell is the Conservative Member of Parliament. David Howell's still alive, by the way, and is currently a Conservative member of the House of Lords. He'd remain the MP for Guildford till 1997. But that shows a very significant swing, a 6% swing to the Conservatives. And people write in their accounts of this period of how Wilson was in the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool watching the results. And there's a luck across the room as the Guildford result comes in. And they just know that the election has been lost. And it was so much worse than they feared. And conversely, in Bexley, Ted Heath's constituency, where he's seen off the rogue who's changed his name by deed poll to match Heath's own name, at least in part to try and discourage people from voting for their own MP, it dawns on them that the election that they had been doomed to lose has in fact been a great shock victory.
But it does actually take quite a long time to count the votes. And the final seat that gives the Conservatives that 316 vote majority isn't actually declared until 2 o'clock in the afternoon the following day. And so that enables Harold Wilson, the day after polling day, to convene one final meeting of the Labour cabinet. And they're quite dramatic scenes because everyone knows that Labour is on its way out. And so this is really a truly lame duck Labour cabinet. One observer likened the crowd that had emerged outside Downing Street as these Labour cabinet figures went into Downing Street for the last time, as like the crowds that would surround the guillotine during the terror, waiting to see the next execution. Marcia Williams, Harold Wilson's political secretary, said, in days gone by, they would have been the ones would have come up to Tyneburn for the spectacle of a public hanging. And each of those cabinet ministers who entered number 10 faced jeers and catcalls and booing. And as that happened, they bowed their heads downcast and in shame, except for one. Dennis Healey, the defense secretary, faced the same booing and jeering, but he turned around to face the crowd. He gave them a big smile and then put up 2 fingers at them. And when he did that, the crowd burst into cheers as he then swiftly turned around and entered into Downing Street.
When reading the memoirs and accounts of this change of power, 2 of the things that really stick in my mind. One of them is that Ted Heath gets back to his flat just off Piccadilly, goes to bed at about 5 a.m. and tells his housekeeper, which he employed, not to disturb him until midday, but to make sure he was up at midday. When she goes and she wakes him up then, she says, Mr. Nixon has been on the phone for you a few times. I've told him you weren't to be disturbed until midday, so he might be calling back any moment. Now, she must have known who a Mr. Nixon was. Of course, it was the American president, but he was fobbed off several times. And then eventually Heath speaks to him. Nixon offers his congratulations and says he looks forward to working with him. And Nixon also says something which Heath recounts, which is that he said, you should now have some time to relax and enjoy the period before inauguration. But of course, there's no inauguration period in British politics. And Heath replies to him, well, I'm off to the palace later on today and I'll be forming a government later on today, so there's no time to relax. It's straight into it. And apparently Nixon said, gosh, what an incredible system. And it wasn't clear if that was a compliment or not. I think we can draw our own conclusions of what Nixon might have thought. The second is that during this time, and you're right, it takes a little while for the final results to be known, and Wilson is packing up, the Wilson family are packing up from number 10, something they didn't expect to be doing that day. And one of the Wilson children plays the song The Carnival Is Over by the Seekers over and over again on their record player as they're packing all their belongings up to leave number 10 for what may be, so far as they know at the time, the very last time. Now, if you listen to the song The Carnival Is Over, it's a real dirge. And if losing the election wasn't enough to send you into a depression, listening to that 40 times on loop, I think certainly would.
And as with any election, especially one where the governing party is defeated, there were some major losses from Parliament in that election. Chief among them, from my view, were George Brown, who was the deputy leader of the Labour Party. Brown had been, earlier in that government, a very senior member of the cabinet. He'd been the first Secretary of State, in effect, the deputy to Wilson. He'd been the Foreign Secretary. Brown had resigned from the government in a fit of pique in 1967, but had remained deputy leader of the party from the backbenches, a precedent which is now being repeated by Lucy Powell, the current deputy leader, and one that I had pointed out at the time when Angela Rayner was under pressure to say that it is possible to be deputy leader of the party from the backbenches, as George Brown was. Brown was viewed as a really tragic loss from Harold Wilson's perspective. Brown had gone around the country campaigning to hold Labour seats, and in Wilson's view, George Brown had sacrificed his own seat of Belper in Derbyshire for the sake of trying to help Labour candidates across the country. Brown was a very charismatic, if somewhat chaotic, campaigner. Another big name who lost in that election was Jenny Lee. She was the widow of Aneurin Bevan, Nye Bevan, the founder of the health service, but she had been, in her own right, a very significant Labour MP. She'd been a minister in the Wilson government. She was the arts minister. She was the minister who was seen as shepherding in the Open University, which really became her own kind of great policy legacy. But she'd been in Parliament for ages. She was first elected to Parliament back in the 1920s. Now, she wasn't there continuously from the 1920s, but she'd been there a very, very long time indeed. But also, what's noteworthy of the 1970 election is not just the MPs who lost, but also the MPs who arrive for the first time, some really important big names. 1970 is the election where Neil Kinnock and John Smith, two future Labour leaders, are elected. John Prescott, the future deputy leader of the Labour Party, is elected in that election. Dennis Skinner, the perennial left-wing backbencher who served in Parliament right up until 2019, was elected in that election. Ian Paisley, the Democratic Unionist Party leader, the figure of the kind of the orange wing of Northern Irish politics, was elected to Parliament for the first time there. And Ken Clarke, the future Conservative Chancellor and perennial leadership candidate, was also elected in that Parliament. So a lot of big names to come were part of the new arrivals across the political spectrum in 1970.
Absolutely. To wrap this episode up, I wanted to offer some thoughts basically on the shock result, on how Heath won the election and how the Wilson gamble to go to the country in June 1970 backfired. This is one of the great debates, really, in post-war political elections and political history. Some of the people who've been listening to this who know a bit about this period will have been screaming at their podcast app of choice that there's two words that have so far been totally absent from the podcast, but really deserve their place. The words World Cup. So in 1966, of course, England had won the World Cup. Never done so since. We'll find out what happens next year soon enough. And just before this election in 1970, England are knocked out of the World Cup. They're 2-0 up with 20 minutes to go against West Germany, their great rivals. And they lose the game 3-2 and are knocked out. And some people say that it is this shock turnaround in England's footballing fortunes that leads to Wilson's own slump in the polls at the very end of the campaign. Other people make the argument that it's the balance of payments figures, that they really burst the bubble of Wilson's complacency around the state of the economy that became a feature of this election campaign and make people look twice at whether or not Wilson has actually been telling them the truth on the state of the economy. Other people suggest, actually perhaps more counterintuitively, that what's going on in this election is that Enoch Powell, in spite of falling out with Ted Heath catastrophically, and in spite of making lots of critical comments about Ted Heath during this election, has actually tapped into a rich seam of political opinion in the country that he nevertheless manages to put in the Conservative camp. Other people's take on how this election ends up happening are perhaps even more unique. So Douglas Hurd, who was the political secretary for Ted Heath, and of course would go on to be a Conservative Member of Parliament, Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary, he said that Heath managed to tap into a body of opinion in the British public that represented a genuine Puritan protest against Wilson and his approach to government. And he allied that with people who were opposed to Charles I in the 17th century, or the Fox North coalition, or in fact the way in which Gladstone would attack Benjamin Disraeli. And that he saw Heath as being the Gladstonian and Wilson, somewhat ironically, as being the Disraeli in that comparison. The view that I want to offer, though, is that the question shouldn't so much be how did Heath win? It should really be, why did people think that Wilson was such a shoo-in at the time? When you look at those midterm blues for Harold Wilson and the Labour Party, the enormous swings in the by-elections, the blowout local elections, and the policy issues that caused them, the devaluation, the failure of in place of strife to get off the ground. A year before polling day, it looks like Wilson has absolutely no chance. Now, undoubtedly, the polls change and Labour's electoral fortunes appear to have changed. But when you have incredibly volatile political opinions like that, just as they can move dramatically in one direction, so they can move dramatically in the other. And to assume that the recovery that Wilson and Labour was able to stage in late 69, 1970 was going to be robust enough to take the party through to success at the election, I think was a folly. Now, expecting Wilson to win easily and with such supreme confidence as people forecast would almost be as if Keir Starmer's opinion polling improved and people thought, oh yes, well, all is forgiven from the midterm electoral woes. I think it is just far too flimsy a basis to predict an election outcome with confidence.
Well, I think the thing is, though, that Wilson had not just the polling evidence, but also the evidence of the 1970 local elections, which for him confirmed the polling. And in a way, the parallel there with 1966 is that the polling looked good for Labour in the winter of 65 to 66. And then you had the whole North by-election, which was a real result that confirmed in Wilson's mind what the polls were saying was true. But you're right that Wilson did probably put too much faith in the polls. And Wilson is said to have said after the election, the opinion polls have a lot of explaining to do.
Well, I think many other defeated leaders have appealed to that source of blame ever since. We finish this podcast, as always, with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment. I'll go first. So I'm currently reading Downing Street Downfalls by Mark Garnett. I think this is a really interesting book that has just come out in the last couple of weeks. In particular, what I think is really interesting about it is we sometimes focus on the particular circumstances of a prime minister's downfall, the way in which their party turns against them or the electorate turn against them, and they leave office. But almost always, in fact, I would say always, the sources of those problems long predate the particular moment of emergency for that political leader. And what Mark Garnett has done here is bring together lots of those different strands, sometimes from much earlier in their political career, let alone their premiership, to consider the ways in which, being the most senior politician in the country, you can be there confidently in place one day and gone brutally removed the next. The other thing that stands out for me about this book is that Mark does have a rare political judgment, and I don't necessarily mean that all as a compliment. So Richard and I both know Mark, and I disagree with him on a huge number of things about political history and about certainly the political present. But he has a view on politics and political events that I enjoy hearing because it always makes me think, because it's not necessarily a view that you're going to hear from all that many other places. And those two things together, thinking about the longer term causes of prime ministerial downfalls and Mark's rare judgment about political history and the events as they come together, is something that I think makes for a really interesting book. And also, of course, one that is deeply relevant at the moment as the Labour Party considers whether or not it wishes to remove Keir Starmer and bring another premiership to its end. Richard, what are you reading at the moment?
I'm reading at the moment Original Sin by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson. This is a book that came out earlier this year about the 2024 US presidential election. And it's a book about, in effect, President Joe Biden's physical and mental decline in the lead up to that election, which of course was the cause for him to dramatically withdraw from the campaign in July of 2024, just before the Democratic convention. This book is written by two people who I think would normally be seen as more friendly to the Democrats. So this is not a group of authors who have a partisan hostility to Joe Biden. And yet this is an extremely damning book, I think, about Joe Biden and about the coterie of advisors, family members, and others hangers-on around him who shielded him from scrutiny, who deceived other political figures, journalists, and the American and world public. I think the thing that stands out to me from this book is just how long it was known that Joe Biden was in decline. The authors of this book argue that his decline was notable from about the time of the death of his son Beau in 2015, when he was still vice president, and people talked about the difficulties he had in remembering names and doing certain events in his final year as vice president of the United States, let alone in 2020 when he runs for president, where it's clear that a lot of the problems that became apparent to us in 2024 were already very much in evidence in 2019, 2020. And I think it leaves me with a sense that there is a big problem in American politics in particular of people who invest their careers and their power, their ambition, and their wealth, in some instances, in the success of one individual who they kind of follow throughout their entire political career. And they know that when that individual finally leaves the stage, it's not just that one individual who loses their power and influence, but it's all of the people around them as well. And I think it seems to me, at least, for really quite selfish reasons, Joe Biden's inner circle put the American public in a scenario which they shouldn't have been put into. And really, Joe Biden should have announced that he was only going to do one term, and there should have been an open democratic primary process to choose his successor. And who knows how that might have affected the outcome in the 2024 general election, but it was something that I think Democrats were really cheated of by quite cynical and selfish political advisors.
We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all from us this week. We'll be back on Christmas Eve with our installment of Matters of Interest, and then next Sunday with our look at what Heath gets up to after his shock victory in 1970 before he goes back to the country in February 1974. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.